710 KURV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. 1-800-580-8255. 1-800-580-TALK, streaming live on KURV.com. Here we are, the voice of reason and education. Doesn't exist anywhere else in the media world. We explain things. We don't just regurgitate the tripe spewed out by the media and by your school teachers. There's a lot of talk these days on Republican strategy. Talk about a contradiction in terms. The Republican Party is politically inept, and its ineptitude is a direct consequence of its lack of integrity. The Republican Party is completely unprincipled, and that is why it loses in every confrontation with the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party is the party of slavery. It is the party of submission. It is the party of racism. But that's what they are. That's what they want to be, and everybody knows it. And that is the policies that they make. So they adhere. You have to hand it to the Democrat Party. They adhere to their principles of racism, of poverty, pro-poverty, of pro-choice, pro-abortion. They adhere to those things, and therefore everybody knows where they're coming from, and they have a solid base. Meanwhile, the Republicans spend most of their time undermining their base, but the reason is that the establishment Republican Party does not like its base, because the Republican base is a true libertarian group. The Republican establishment is just that, a political establishment that seeks nothing more than its aggrandizement. The budget is completely out of control, and why is that? There's all this. Look at the Republican strategy. Republicans say that they're going to try to cut spending. Talk about a losing strategy. Can they be more inept, or is it just a question that they are simply part and parcel of the Democrat Party? The bottom line is that it's a losing strategy. If you go out there and you start talking about cutting spending, well, they have to cut spending from somewhere, and therefore, whoever they want to cut spending to, whether it's for Medicaid, Medicare, education, whatever it happens to be, there's this gigantic constituency which the media then utilizes in order to browbeat the Republicans until they finally cave in yet again. The politicians are not very bright. They're narcissists more than anything else, power-hungry, control freaks. And they really don't have the intelligence to be able to come up with a solution to the problem that the politicians themselves actually created. The budget of the United States is over $4 trillion. That is greater than the entire economies of all but 3 or 4 countries. I think there's only 3 countries in the world that have a gross domestic product greater than our budget, and one of those countries, of course, is the United States. There's only 2 other countries outside the United States that have an entire gross domestic product greater than our budget, and those 2 countries are China and Japan. The federal budget is almost 4 times greater than the gross domestic product of Russia. Aside from that, besides the $4 trillion that the federal government spends, the state governments spend about $1.5 trillion. So if you add the total expenditure of state and federal governments combined, it is the second largest economy in the world. Therefore, the United States, with a population that is 22nd, less than 5% of the world population is the United States population. we have a government spending more money than any other country even even produces, and that includes China. So therefore, how is it that there doesn't seem to be enough money to pay for education, to pay for health care, to pay for everything else that we need for infrastructure? And the reason is that most of the money, and we have to be careful about our terminology, we don't want to say it's wasted, because that would mean that it is somehow being spent inadvertently. The money is not wasted, it is misappropriated. It is misappropriated towards those with political influence. The reason the budget cannot be controlled is because most of the money, probably 70% of the monies that are allocated, are misappropriated to those of political influence. And the reason the budget will never be changed, why the problem will never ameliorate, is because everybody has their favored constituency. And in order to guarantee that your constituency remains protected, you have to promise to protect the constituencies of your peers. And that's what happens every single time. In other words, if I am a Republican in a certain district, I want my fat cats protected. The only way that I can guarantee that, because I'm just one person of 100 or 435, the only way I can guarantee that is to promise the Democrat or the other Republican that their constituencies will also be protected when any vote comes up. Therefore, that is why things go on the way they do. It is because every senator or congressman or president or bureaucrat wishes to protect his or her own constituency, and in doing so promises to protect the constituencies of their peers. That is why this talk about not reading legislation is just a bunch of blather. The reason that congressmen and senators and presidents don't read legislation is because it is not relevant to their interests. All they need to know is that what they put in there to protect their own constituency of fat cats is going to be voted for by the other side, because the other side is going to because they know that you're going to vote to protect their constituency of fat cats. And therefore, there's no reason for the politicians to read the bills placed before them upon which they will eventually vote, because what's in the bill is irrelevant. What the bill discusses is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if the bill talks about health care or agriculture or energy policies or anything else, as long as everyone's fat cats are protected. That is why, with a budget, federal and state, that combined at $5.5 trillion does not ever seem to be enough money, that there doesn't ever seem to be enough that they can spend. It is because the question arises, can a fat cat have too much money? Most people asked if they have enough will say no, they want more. That is the same no matter how wealthy someone is. A perfect example of the human psychology is the Mexican president. I don't want to blame them too much, but it's a pretty well-known example how and they're not, of course, it's not just them. It doesn't matter if you're Mexican, Russian, Chinese, or whatever. They all wander off with billions of dollars of funds which don't belong to them, which is a major reason they become politicians anyway, is to reap the rewards of power and money. But why is it necessary for the presidents of Mexico to wander off with $2 billion or $3 billion or $4 billion of stolen money? Isn't $100 million enough? How about $500 million? You don't think maybe $500 million is enough? You really have to steal $3 billion? You don't think you can squeak by, make your bottom line match, get your budget in there. You don't think it's your personal lifestyle or lifestyle of your family. You don't think they can get by on 100 million or 500 million. Is it really necessary to steal $3 billion? Well, yes, it is in their eyes necessary to steal $3 billion because there's never enough for them. So there'll never be enough for the crooks in the United States. And, of course, those crooks that are really important are not in jail. They are the executives of Goldman Sachs, of Wells Fargo, of Bank of America, of Chrysler, of General Motors, and many, many other large corporations, Pfizer and all the rest, that reap billions of dollars in graft profits through legislation and regulations. And they're never going to have enough, never. And so therefore, it doesn't matter if they have 500 million, they want 600 million. It doesn't matter if they have $1 billion, they want $2 billion. If they have 5 billion, they want 6 billion. It doesn't matter. They'll never have enough because that's the psychology that they are. A thief is a thief, and a thief never has enough. There's always one more job for the thief. That's the way things go. So that's why things will never improve and why the country is doomed to perdition. Now, let's take a look at the last election. All the truth of the last election is completely avoided. The most important thing, there's two important points of the last election. One is that there are less people that voted in the last election than voted in the 2008 election. 3 million people less voted, 3 million fewer voters in the last election than in 2008. No one even talks about that. And since the last election, 2008 to the 2012 election, there were about 4 million new voters, potential voters, added to the polls. That means that, and 50% of those should have voted, that means that the actual vote tally is about 5 million less than the previous election. No one addresses that issue. Barack Obama got 3.5 million less votes this time than the last time. Mitt Romney actually got 1 million more votes this time than John McCain did last time. What that means is that rather than vote for Mitt Romney, the 3.5 million people that did not vote for Barack Obama decided not to vote at all. And what does that say about Mitt Romney and the Republicans when 3.5 people who no longer wanted to vote for Barack Obama decided that it was better for them not to vote at all? What other interesting statistic is there? Well, the total vote between Romney and Barack Obama was 126 million votes. And no one seems to bring up the point that in a country of 250 million adults, non-institutionalized adults, that only 126 million, or half, voted. No one seems to bring up the point that 125 or 124 million people, at least 124 million people, did not vote. Barack Obama won this election with about 66 million votes. 125 million people did not vote. That means the people who did not vote are almost double the amount of the votes that Barack Obama got. Well, what does that say about the election process? Well, first of all, it's a fraud. It's a fraud if you have 250 million non-institutionalized adult Americans and 66 million of those voted for Barack Obama. That means that 190 million or so Americans voted did not vote for Barack Obama. What does that make Barack Obama getting less than 25% of the potential vote? Well, it certainly does not give him a mandate. Why is this information absent from anything in the news media? Let's look at what else is absent from the news media. Let's take a look at the employment situation. There's this canard that the number of unemployed, or the percentage of unemployed, is going down. But let's take a look at those numbers. There are less people employed today than there were employed in 2001. Taking into account that since 2001, we've added about 20 million or so new job seekers. And we have less people employed today than in 2001. That means there's at least 20 million people looking for jobs that have never been in the job market. If we look at the way they calculate out the percentage of the unemployed, they look at the number of total potentially employed, but those exclude, the potentially employed exclude those who have left the job market and those who have never been in the job market. And since you have 20 million Americans who've never been in the job market, they're not counted. And you have about 90 million Americans who are out of the job market, and they're not counted. But let's take a look at the numbers of those out of the job market. From the years 2001 to 2008, to the end of 2008, about an average of 1 million more Americans left the job market than the previous year. So over those 8 years, about 8 million Americans left the job market. And that has been the average since the population has been about 300 million people. As soon as Barack Obama became president, things changed a bit. Instead of 1 million a year leaving the job market, it became 2 million a year. And so that in the 4 years of Barack Obama presidency, 8 million Americans have left the job market compared to the 8 years of the Bush presidency where 8 million people left the job market. That means that if those who left the job market had maintained the same rate of leaving the job market of 1 million per year, that would mean that if it remained the same with Barack Obama, as it ought to have, because the reason people left the job market is because they got tired of looking for what wasn't there, using the same standard as George Bush, that means there are at least 4 million people that need to be added to the unemployment rolls, which would take the unemployment roll from 12.5 million to 16.5 million, which makes the true unemployment rate not the falsely promoted 7.8%, but the true unemployment rate of 16 million people takes us up to about 12%. So even based upon that one simple factor, and there's other factors, that in and of itself means that the true unemployment rate, even calculated by the ridiculous way that the government calculates unemployment, ought to be over 12%. Let's take a look into other little things about the election. Barack Obama got 93% of the black vote. The black vote is 13% of the voting population. That means with a voting population of about 125 million, that means that about 15 million, 16 million, 10% of 120 is 12.5, another 3.6, so about 16 million of the votes are black voters. 93% voted for Barack Obama, so if you give him 93% of the vote, that means of those 16 million, he got about 15 million votes. So 15 million blacks voted for Barack Obama, 1 million for Mitt Romney. If that vote was split along the lines of the Hispanic voting population, which is 70-30, which is a whole nother story, with all the bias that's in the Hispanic population and their voting profiles, let's just use that, even as egregious as that is, 70-30, even if it's as egregious as that is. If we apply that to the black population, where 70% of the blacks had voted for Barack Obama and 30% for Mitt Romney, then you have a shift of about 3 million votes away from Barack Obama. If you do that, you take away 3 million votes from Barack Obama, which takes him down to about 63 million, and you add the 3 million votes to Mitt Romney, puts him at 64 million, Mitt Romney wins the election. So even if the blacks had voted the way the Hispanics voted, 70-30, which is absurd anyway, because why are you voting 70-30? It doesn't make any sense unless you're biased or racist, which is the case, which is what it is in this case, because the Democrat Party is the party of racism. Let us never forget that. because they're the ones who say you can't make it because of your race. You speak Spanish, you can't make it. We need bilingual education. You're black, you can't make it. We need set-asides. We need quotas. We need affirmative action. The Democrat Party is the party of racism. Also the party of slavery. Let us not forget that. Also the party of the Ku Klux Klan. Let us not forget that. The Democrat Party is the party of Jim Crow laws, and let us never forget that. The Democrat Party is the party of racism, always has been, and always will be, because that's how they get elected. So, just if the blacks had voted even 70 to 30% Barack Obama to Mitt Romney would have won the election. So let's get real, folks. This whole thing is a bunch of nonsense. The election is the non-producing classes, and the fascists and the slaveholders are the ones that gave Barack Obama the electoral win. So the Republican strategy is non-existent. The Republican strategy is unprincipled, and that is why, and therefore the Republicans are actually very similar to the Democrats. That is why the Republicans are having such difficulty in motivating the 125 million non-voters. The 125 million non-voters do not vote because they don't believe in government. Those who believe in government, they vote. Why don't 125 million people vote? Because they cannot discern any difference between the Democrat and the Republican Party. And so they don't vote. So the 125 million people that voted for none of the above, that is what they have chosen, none of the above. The Republicans refuse to put in a candidate that will address that issue because for the Republicans, it is much more important that the establishment center Republican Party stay in power. That is much more important to them than to be principled. They would prefer to lose. The Republicans would prefer to lose than allow a non-establishment Republican, such as a Ronald Reagan, for example, to become president. Before we go on here, I'm going to take this phone call from John, who's been patiently waiting. John, thanks for calling, 7 KRV. What's your comment, please?
Well, just like with Lincoln, I mean, the true story on him has never really been told in the history books. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, look what happened after that.
What is the true story of Lincoln?
Well, Lincoln, we don't know whether he would have freed the slaves or sent them back to Africa if he would have got. There was some talk that they were going to send some of the blacks back to where they came from. The war was over.
Right. Well, John, the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, which was given in January of 1863, which is interesting since the war started in 1861, why Lincoln waited so long, was really an attempt by Abraham Lincoln to create a second front for the hard-pressed Union troops. Lincoln was a racist. He said it many, many times. He thought that the black race was inferior. And the basic problem he had with the slavery issue is that it was taking jobs away from white Americans. He belonged to a group that was promoting the repatriation of blacks to Africa. In his inaugural address, he said he had no intention of ending slavery. In the Emancipation Proclamation, the only states in which the slaves were emancipated were in the Confederacy. There were 4 states, Maryland, Kentucky, a couple others I can't remember offhand, which are slaveholding states that were not part of the Confederacy. They were excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, which meant that Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves in 4 states in which there were slaves. So it's completely politically motivated. Abraham Lincoln was a fascist He was responsible for the greatest loss of life in any American war. He may very well have been the first leader of a nation that actually targeted civilian population for slaughter. He purposely targeted civilians in the South to be murdered and to be starved out. I'm not aware. Every war before that was army against army, government against government. I think this was the first war in which there was an attempt, in which there was a purposeful tactic to actually kill, to murder, and destroy a civilian population. That was Abraham Lincoln. Anything else, John?
They went on to South Carolina, and there was pillaging all the way there,
Well, of course, the famous burn, in Georgia and the burning of Atlanta. So this is the great icon to equality. This is the one that Steven Spielberger wants to present to us as a great humanitarian. Abraham Lincoln was a racist and a fascist and a murderer and a killer of women and children. And that is the one that Steven Spielberger wants to exalt. Okay, we're down to the last few seconds. Do you have anything else to say?
Well, sure. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was another one.
FDR was a racist and a fascist and a communist. He was an anti-Semite, as was his wife. He attempted to turn our nation into a fascist nation and did. We went to World War II, not to save Europe, but to save Joseph Stalin and hand over Eastern Europe to the communists. Thanks for calling, John. 7 KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. We'll be back with some excerpts of my upcoming book, The Fall from Grace. I'm going to read an excerpt on the personality of politicians and members of government. 7 KRV, back after this break. We're back. 7 KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. Streaming live on KURV.com. I'm going to give a little excerpt here from, a little excerpt from my soon-to-be-released book on the truth. I guess that's it, on the truth. Where we educate the population. It's going to contain things you're not really going to see anywhere else. I do see little bits and snips coming out here and there about people that are finally catching up to my way of thinking, but it's rudimentary. But here we go. Just one little clip to give you an idea. This is the title of this section is called "The Personality of Politicians and Members of Government." Confusion of terms is a mainstay of propagandists. Therefore, an authentic political scientist must have an in-depth understanding of each system of governance that is to be assessed if an accurate definition is to be assigned to the terms conservative and liberal as they are comprehended within the context of a particular society. This requires knowledge of each nation's ideological foundation. The scientific denotation of conservative is the preservation of the original. With this meaning, an accurate assessment can be drawn of the implications associated with assigning anticipated behavior to those functioning under a particular appellation. In politics, conservative, regardless of the opinion of benighted political scientists, has only one valid definition: a person who desires government to function strictly according to original principles. Liberal, being the opposite, stands for someone in politics who desires government to function either outside the original principles of the nation or who twists the original principles into another meaning. Therefore, the same term may signify very different behaviors depending on the society being referenced. For example, in a communist state of total government control, a conservative is one who adheres to continuing maximum government authority. In a nation based on a libertarian system, a conservative is one who adheres to continuing minimal government control. Conversely, in a government-dominated system such as communism, liberals seek to reduce government authority relative to the people. In an individualist-based system, democracy, liberals seek to increase government authority relative to the people. The purpose of government is to impose on the entire nation the rules formulated by the governing class. People tend to be self-serving, and those entering politics usually harbor a highly concentrated form of this characteristic, combined with an overarching desire to impose their will on others. Therefore, the natural tendency of government, based on the proclivity of politicians, combined with the purpose of government's existence, is to promote the expansion of authority. Limited government is a contradiction in terms, because historically all governments have attempted to gain power at the expense of the individual. The philosophy of a limited government is an anathema to the average politician, bureaucrat, and elitist, and contrary to their intrinsic psychological drive to control. As a consequence of these factors, the logical conclusion regarding the ultimate nature of governance is absolute government control. The only way to prevent the creation of this Frankenstein's monster is contingent on the existence of a superior political authority to restrict this natural progression. A constitution that sets boundaries on political behavior will prevent expansion beyond the limits of the founders' original intent. Of course, this requires the political class to adhere to constitutional principles. Two types of individuals populate government: the careerist and the non-careerist. The non-careerist tends to be an ideologue who adheres to original principles. The careerist is a professional politician or a lifelong bureaucrat and considers government service to be a career. He or she believes in government for its own sake. The non-careerist considers government service to be temporary, not a career, and perceives government not as existing for its own sake, but as providing the means to implement a particular ideology in society. Then the relationship between those within a system of governance is divided in two, conservative and liberal. The conservative adheres to original principles, while the liberal deviates from original principles. Thus, in a statist environment, such as an aristocratic, communist, or fascist state, the conservative adheres to a statist philosophy, while the liberal tends towards a more individualistic society. In an individualist society, such as a democracy or a republic, the conservative adheres to an individualistic philosophy of governance, while the liberal leans more towards a statist philosophy. Individualists manifest a philosophy of governance based upon egalitarianism, while the statist manifests a philosophy of governance based upon control by an elite. Thus, depending on the system, a conservative can be either a statist or an individualist, and a liberal can be either an individualist or a statist. Within a system based on the philosophy of government supremacy, the non-careerist and the careerist have the same viewpoint. Both promote the original ideology of absolute government control over the population. In the United States system of a constitutional democratic republic, the people were intended to be the supreme element, with the result that careerists and non-careerists tend to be at odds. The careerists perceive government to be a necessary good and the most important component of society. They consider themselves a physical part of the government, an essential cog in the monolithic machinery of the regime, and are proponents of authoritarian rule. All bureaucrats, nearly all politicians, and all of their staffs are careerists. The non-careerists in the United States system of constitutionally guaranteed individual rights view public service as a temporary activity requiring personal sacrifice. They perceive government to be a necessary evil existing only to preserve individual rights. These non-careerists identify themselves as belonging to the general population, not to the government, and are opponents of an over-assertive government authority. This dichotomy results in a permanent careerist class becoming the dominant component of any government. it imprints the careerist philosophy as natural to government. In a communist system, the non-careerist promotes an original ideology of maximum government control, which is in exact alignment with that of the careerist who has natural pro-big government inclinations. In the American system, the non-careerist promotes an original ideology of individual freedom with limited government, which is opposite that of the big government careerists. The careerists in all systems promotes government dominance. The non-careerist in the American government struggles against that natural proclivity of politicians and the mechanics of government. Thus, the non-careerist in the American system is at a distinct disadvantage, swimming against the flow of government, while the careerist who is promoting government dominance has the advantage of swimming with the flow. In the United States, the two dominant political parties are the Democrat or Liberal Party, and the Republican or the Conservative Party. Liberal meaning outside original ideology or a statist ideology, and conservative meaning adhering strictly to the original ideology or an individualist ideology. The Democrat Party platform calls for significant government control over society, while the Republican Party platform ostensibly calls for a more limited government control over society. However, careerists dominate both parties' establishment centers, calling for a significant level of central planning. It is at the extremes that the variance appears between the two parties. On one hand, the Democratic Party's extreme ideological elements demand ever-increasing levels of government authority. This is in line with the general credo of its centrists. On the other hand, the Republican Party's extreme ideological elements demand strict limits on government authority. This is contrary to the general credo of its centrists. Thus, the centers of both parties are, by definition, fascist in nature. But as one moves further from the center, the extreme elements of the Democrat Party accentuate the focus of its center, while the extreme elements of the Republican Party run counter to the focus of its center. The extreme of the Democrat Party is communism, total government control, which is basically ideologically consistent with its center. The extreme of the Republican Party is libertarianism, which is ideologically inconsistent with its center. This is why, in practical terms, the Republican Party is noted for fractious infighting, while the Democrat Party is more unified. The distinction between the centers of the Democrat Party and Republican Party is more form than substance. Both believe in government control, the only difference being which party should be in control. Because the only political group adhering to the nation's founding ideology of independence is the extreme component of the Republican Party, this represents the only ideologically pure conservative element. All of the rest within both parties hold views that are inconsistent with the founding principles and are thus classified as liberals. Only a small fraction of the political class, consisting primarily of non-careerists, adhere to the founding ideology of limited government and maximum individual liberty. They remain hopelessly in the minority. Conservatives or individualist ideologues hold that all have equal potential, and the best way to help those who are poor and needy is by providing an environment of equal opportunity in order to allow each to help his or herself. Liberals or statist ideologues are elitists, believing the poor and the needy are incapable of helping themselves under any circumstance and require continuing government assistance. Conservatives realize that government aid tends to increase dependency and is counterproductive. Yet the conservative ideology of individualism, where each person is permitted to manifest his or her talents without encroachment by the government, is misrepresented in the media and the system of education as heartless opposition to helping the poor and the needy. The conservative position is thus repeatedly and erroneously portrayed in the press in a negative light as callous indifference to those in poverty. The liberal ideology dooms large segments of the population to generation upon generation of ignorance, poverty, indifference, cultural implosion, and enmity towards society. This meshes perfectly with the liberal psychological predilection favoring a dominant central government. Though masquerading under the guise of humanitarian, its subsidizing of the non-productive is the means to augment government power, the liberals' true goal. The conservative ideology, based upon constitutionally grounded philosophy of individualism, is blind to race, ethnicity, and gender. All individuals are considered equal under the law, and each person is to be measured based on individual performance. Thus, conservatives refuse to provide aid based simply on color, ethnicity, or gender, and are falsely portrayed as racist, ethnocentric, and sexist. The truth is the exact opposite. It is the liberal position of providing race, ethnicity, and gender-based benefits that is inherently biased and demeaning, because liberals do not believe that all races, ethnicities, and the female gender have the capability of making it on their own. Liberals measure each person not independently, but rather as a member of a particular group. Each individual within the group is characterized as manifesting human capabilities that are supposedly indigenous to that group. It is the liberal position that demonstrates true racism, ethnocentricity, and gender bias. Yet the liberal position, which condemns entire groups of people to permanent government dependency, is portrayed in the press as caring and charitable. So twisted is the portrayal that conservatives in the United States, whose ideology is based on individual liberty, freedom, and independence, are portrayed as fascist, while the liberals who have enslaved millions to enervating psychological dependency are presented as freedom fighters. A good example of the distinction between the parties is drawn in the comparison between the two dominant presidents of the 20th century, former Presidents Ronald Reagan and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Both represented the more extreme elements of their respective parties. Reagan was a reluctant politician. His political career is noted by more conflict within his own party than even with the opposition Democrat Party, of which he was once a member. Ronald Reagan, as president, acted opposite the natural inclination of most politicians by proposing less government control and more individual freedom. This is contrary to the philosophy of the Republican center and, in fact, of the vast majority of politicians and bureaucrats who seek total control of society by government. Thus, Reagan was always viewed as an outsider, not only by Democrats, but also by Republicans, and this is the reason Reagan was so vilified by the media, which acted as an arm of the government. Once Reagan was out of office, his philosophy was abandoned, and he is now considered an anachronism. Compare this to the Democrat Party's icon, Franklin Roosevelt. He was a professional and eager lifelong politician. He acted in concert with the natural inclination of most politicians rather than in opposition, as Reagan had done. A member of the Democrat Party's extreme wing, he, unlike Reagan, represented the deepest desires of the centrist element. Roosevelt is embraced not only by Democrat leadership and the rank and file, but also by a significant portion of the Republican political class. Roosevelt achieved what politicians incessantly yearn for, the population's dependency on government. He fostered a dependency on government-sponsored programs never before attained in the United States. His philosophy of governance by a dominant political class over a dependent population remains in the mainstream of political thought of both parties. Strictly based on political gamesmanship, the Democrats should always be victorious. There is another element to be counted, however, the people. The battle within the populace pits the individualists desiring a society based on government dependency against those desiring a society based on independence, on individuals. The battle within the populace pits individuals desiring a society based on government dependency against those desiring a society based on independence from government. Theoretically, the winner of the ideological struggle would determine which party would come to power, either the party of dependency, the Democrat, or the party of independence, the Republican. Yet theory does not translate to reality because the Republican Party, for all of its lip service paid to constitutional principles, is in actuality made in the image of the Democrat Party. This should be anticipated because most people running for office and the vast majority of their staffs are politicians and careerists first. The majority of those who populate government, regardless of party affiliation, seek to increase the authority of government. Politicians of both parties manifest a tendency to promote dependency because this expands government authority. As the natural tendency of government is to increase its authority, and its authority grows when the numbers of the dependent increase, both parties tend to implement policies to give more aid to the dependent while promoting and fostering programs to increase the numbers of the dependent. As the center establishment of both parties adheres to the philosophy of government authority, then the growing dependency over time of an ever greater proportion of society becomes the effect of government policy, regardless of which party is in control. Both parties promote the policy of bestowing of selective entitlements, creating, maintaining, and even enlarging the programs, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, public education, and many others that create dependency. All Democrats and Republican establishments support the educational process, which promotes big government. The Republican Party has instituted dependency-increasing programs such as the Americans with Disability Act, its expansion and the No Child Left Behind policy, has created the unconstitutional Environmental Protection Agency and Homeland Security, has developed policies that institute invasions of privacy, has established a Medicare Part D program, has appointed justices holding philosophies which were anti-constitutional, Earl Warren, David Souter, Anthony Kennedy, and Sandra Day O'Connor, and committed a number of other unconstitutional acts, all of which have increased government authority at the expense of individual liberty. The Republican centrist establishment is so inculcated with the psychology of the careerist politician that between a Democrat winning an election or a conservative Republican, the Republican establishment will often side with the Democrat. The Republican establishment would prefer to lose an election than allow the conservative element to gain control of the party. The United States government, as it is with all governments, leads society to ever greater levels of dependency, resulting in ever greater levels of government authority. The result has been the nation's transformation from one adhering to the revolutionary ideology of individual liberty into one with a statist ideology of government control. People's natural psychological tendency to be dependent, combined with the natural proclivity of those in government to control, and the natural mechanism of government to exert control, makes this result an eventual certainty. The understanding as we know it. That was an excerpt from my upcoming book. The understanding of the political system as we know it, promulgated through the propaganda arm of the government called the mass media, exists to confuse the American public so that they will be disunited and in disarray. The conservative and liberal philosophies vary because the terms conservative and liberal vary in and of themselves. That is why you so often see those of one side easily converting to one on the other side, and vice versa, because there is such a nebulous understanding of what conservative and liberal is. Conservative has nothing to do with a particular viewpoint on social issues. Conservative has nothing to do with any particular viewpoint whatsoever. It is only related to the observance of, within a nation, of a certain philosophy. And as the philosophy varies, then what a conservative or a liberal is will also vary, because because the philosophies, different philosophies, are existent in different governments. So the terms conservative and liberal and all this other nonsense is what we see or hear all the time. But we never talk about the true distinction, which is between those of an individualist ideology and those of statist ideology. This is where the true political drama ought to be fought. Individualists believing in the power of the individual over the state, statists believing in the power of the state over the individual. That is the true dichotomy. Why is that a dichotomy why is that absent from the press and the media? Well, the reason is because those terms are easily understandable. If you say conservative, I was reading this book the other day about what the meaning of conservative is, and every chapter was written by a different author, and every chapter had a different view of what conservative means. In the scientific world, that could never happen. A term means one thing and one thing alone. A proton has certain properties, and those properties do not change based upon the author. The properties of a proton are intrinsic and unvarying. Scientific principle is therefore fixed. Political principle is not. The reason that the terms conservative and liberal are used and not the terms individualist and statist is because individualist means a particular thing that does not change, and statist means a particular thing and that does not change. And if those were the terms that were to be used in the political discourse, then it would be easy to identify one side versus the other, individualist versus statist. This would be counterproductive to the political class, which depends upon confusion in order to stay in power. We must understand that the political class wishes to stay in power, and if you have a two-party system and when one has more power than the other, or control or ostensible control of the government, it is in the interest of the out-of-power party to maintain the structure of government control, because one day they feel they will be the ones in control and they don't want to diminish the power of government so that it'll be totally powerful when they take control. 7th and KRV, TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, holding their microphone. We'll be back after this short commercial break. 7th and KRV. Seven ten KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home there, microphone, streaming live on KURV.com, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. The awareness that government is an inanimate mechanism directed by human beings becomes suppressed until forgotten or ignored. In the minds of the populace, the perception of government undergoes a metamorphosis, transformed into a being omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. This perception is constructed through an ongoing indoctrination by all institutionalized organs of information. The intent of those in government is the crafting of an artifice perceived as beyond the conceptualization of the ordinary citizen, and requiring a political class to translate its mysteries into the comprehensible. Those manipulating the machinery of governance remain nameless and faceless, known by the title representing their function. Represented, congressman, senator, president, whatever. Though the human embodiment of the title is temporary, the title is immortal, imprinting the nature of government as endless. The realm of existence for the citizen is confined to the permissible, dictated by the ruling class. The individual's only significance relates to the ability to support and strengthen the state in its competition with other states. we have become a nation of bobbleheads, unthinkingly nodding in assent to all the fabrications, misinformation, deceptions, and deceit promulgated by government and its useful dupes and fellow travelers for no other reason than it originates from those having assumed authority. I would be remiss if we did not discuss the topic of the abortion of the in utero infant in this 40th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, which created the non-existent right to murder. The power over life and death is the aspiration of every government. The abortion of the in utero infant issue is perceived as a disagreement between legitimate conflicting ideologies. Those who express the anti-abortion position are identified as tethered to a viewpoint grounded in spiritual religious doctrine. The pro-choice position is grounded in the women's rights movement. This reduces the argument to personal convictions rather than objective criteria, thus making it appear to be a quarrel between antagonists who present equal but opposite and irreconcilable viewpoints isolated from scientific proof. Such reasoning is fallacious. The Roe v. Wade decision is based on junk law and junk science. It shall be shown that the Roe v. Wade decision was unconstitutional and scientifically baseless without a shred of legitimacy and was promoted by the pro-choice movement due to its members' utter moral and ethical bankruptcy. The case of Roe v. Wade involved a pregnant single woman who brought a class action suit challenging the constitutionality of the Texas criminal abortion laws. The majority of politicians favor a pro-choice agenda because this meshes with their proclivity to favor big government, and every government lusts for power over life and death. An agenda that involved the collusion of government with a number of vociferous, belligerent advocates of abortion, known collectively as the pro-choice movement, asserted that passing legislation that permitted abortion on demand was unnecessary because hidden within the Constitution, previously unnoticed for nearly 2 centuries, was a constitutional right to abortion. The Congress, the President, and the people were bypassed, and the authority to legislate was usurped by the Supreme Court, which was composed of justices who were not directly subject to the electoral process. Courts ostensibly are structured to isolate the decision makers from emotion and transitory popular sentiments, to enable them to reach decisions objectively. As part of the central government's apparatus, however, the natural inclination of the justices is to increase centralized power whenever possible. At first, the justices involved paid perfunctory lip service to neutrality. As they wrote in the decision, our task, of course, is to resolve the issue by constitutional measurement free of emotion and of predilection. Yet, in due course, the mask of disinterest was discarded, and the court proceeded to do the exact opposite by incorporating subjective opinions that were skewed towards a preconceived agenda, devoid of any objectivity. When the justices wrote, "We forthwith acknowledge our awareness of the sensitive and emotional nature of the abortion controversy, of the vigorous opposing views, and of the deep and seemingly absolute convictions that the subject inspires. One's philosophy, one's experiences, one's exposure to the raw edges of human existence, one's attitudes towards life and family and their values are all likely to influence and to color one's thinking and conclusions about abortion. In addition, population growth, pollution, poverty, and racial overtones tend to complicate and not to simplify the problem." That is what is written in the Roe v. Wade decision. These comments are devoid of any valid objective foundation, substituting in its stead the subjective varying perceptions of population growth, pollution, poverty, and racial overtones, which are neither universal nor constant. These ever-changing perceptions are viewed through the prisms of narrow time frames and Anyway, the court applied logic to its faulty logic to its historical perspective, saying it perhaps is not generally appreciated that the restrictive of criminal abortion laws in effect in a majority of states today are of relatively recent vintage. The court then added, we are also told abortion was practiced in Greek times as well as in Roman era, and that it was resorted to without scruple. Greek and Roman law afforded little protection to the unborn. Outdated practices and beliefs based on mistaken notions in the light of present-day knowledge are irrelevant. Customs do not increase in validity with the passage of time. Behavior based on erroneous beliefs does not assume legitimacy as a consequence of their duration and must cease once the truth is revealed. Rather than looking to science and the Constitution to elucidate its decision, the court delved into the distant past, using beliefs of another era. Some ancient beliefs and customs hold to this day. The more than 2,000-year-old venerated Hippocratic oath taken by physicians was placed into evidence. The oath's prohibition against physicians intentionally killing the in utero infant is so well known, which states, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy, that the court could not ignore the oath's existence or its opposition to abortion, but addressed it only to refute its tenet. It did so by attacking the oath as a not truly representative of a universally accepted ideology among physicians, and by citing from a work of another respected physician, Dr. Edelstein, in his book Ancient Medicine, which appeared to refute the oath's acceptance by the medical profession. Edelstein stated, the oath originated in a group representing only a small segment of Greek opinion, and that it certainly was not accepted by all ancient physicians. Yet Edelstein's assessment was quantitative, not qualitative, and did not address the validity of the oath, only stated it was adhered to by a minority of physicians at the time. Majority opinion is very often wrong, and the worth of an idea is independent of its relative popularity. Ignored was the justification of the Hippocratic Oath with its prohibition against abortion of the in utero infant, which has been passed down from generation to generation of physicians. An AMA report released by its Committee on Criminal Abortion in May 1857 continued to promote legitimate physicians' long-held opposition to the legalized abortion of the in utero infant. That position stated, the widespread popular ignorance of the true character of the crime, the abortion of the infant's life, a belief even among mothers themselves that the fetus is not alive till after the period of quickening. These errors, which are sufficient in most instances to prevent conviction, are based and only based upon mistaken and exploded medical dogmas. It fails to recognize it, the in utero infant, and to its life as yet denies all protection. The court's methodology was to refute each piece of evidence of an anti-abortion stance with a parallel one that took a pro-abortion stance, regardless of its merit. Thus, in opposition to the AMA report of 1857, the court submitted an AMA opinion from 1970, which said, polarization of polarization of the medical profession on this controversial issue, abortion of the in utero infant, influenced by the rapid changes in state laws and by the judicial decisions which tend to make abortion more freely available, and a feeling that this trend will continue. Unlike the previous statement from the AMA, which is based on scientific fact, this latter statement is legal opinion, reflecting a political trend and written to curry favor with pro-choice advocates while being devoid of any scientific basis. The AMA receives millions of dollars in federal subsidies annually and will thus parrot any position the government wishes. The court incorporated outmoded and discarded principles to defend its decision. The concept of quickening, the first recognizable movement of the fetus in utero, usually appearing from the 16th to the 18th week of pregnancy, was once used as the first proof of life. Quickening is a term of historical curiosity, immaterial in the age of microscopes and ultrasound imaging devices, and thus discarded by modern medicine. But the concept is nevertheless repeatedly referred to as if legitimate throughout the Roe v. Wade decision in its defense of legalizing abortion on demand. In the decision, it says, "It is undisputed that a common law abortion performed before quickening was not an indictable offense. The significance of quickening was echoed by later common law scholars and found its way into the received common law in this country. The absence of common law crime for pre-quickening abortion appears to have developed from a confluence of earlier philosophical, theological, and civil and canon law concepts of when life begins." That is what they said in the decision. But of what legitimacy is behavior based on ignorance in the light of present-day knowledge? Laws based on what can now be proved to be myth are void. Today, there are numerous methods to demonstrate proof of life long before the signs of quickening, which appear at about 16 weeks post-gestation. There is no place in society for the continuation of practices based on erroneous beliefs, for no other reason that in some previous era they were accepted. The court then added, "Thus it has been argued that a state's real concern in enacting a criminal abortion law was to protect the pregnant woman, that is, to restrain her from submitting to a procedure that placed her life in serious jeopardy. They claim that most state laws were designed solely to protect the woman." That is what is said in the decision. This posits the ludicrous notion that the ban on abortion was to protect the health and safety of the mother. As operations go, abortion performed in a proper environment is among the simplest and least risky of all operative procedures. If it were true that concern for the mother's health was paramount, then the logical solution would have been not to ban abortions, but to legalize abortion, thus permitting the simple procedure to be performed in a proper hospital environment by competent physicians. That this was not the case illustrates that the basis of the prohibition on abortion was not concern about a mother's health, but instead was intended to prevent the killing of the in utero infant. The court also resorted to ancient mysticisms, discarded fallacy, and opinions such as, and this is what is written in the decision, "There has always been strong support for the view that life does not begin until live birth. This was the belief of the Stoics." And the court continues, "The Aristotelian theory of immediate animation, the soul is incorporated at some unknown time after conception, that held sway throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe. Although these are obviously absurd statements from ancient times, they are arguments used today by those in the pro-choice movement to justify abortion on demand. These arguments include the following gibberish," and this is written in the decision. "The view of life beginning at conception have substantial problems for precise definition of this view are posed, however, by new embryological data that purport to indicate that conception is a process over time rather than an event." That is what is said in the decision. Truth is not tethered to either time frames or popularity. If a custom or a tradition is maintained for 1,000 years, this does not add an iota of value to its relative worth, nor does a belief's relative popularity alter its veracity. The moment truth is discovered, a lifetime of falsehood instantaneously vaporizes. The Earth is not the center of the solar system, despite this being believed for hundreds of years. Legitimacy is not granted to societies that practice slavery, serfdom, and the subjugation of women simply by their having endured for greater periods of time than have those societies that ban such loathsome practices. Popular beliefs have frequently been found erroneous. Nevertheless, the court applied various distortions to achieve its fallacious conclusions. The court fabricated non-existent rights. This is what is said in the decision. This right of privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. We therefore conclude that the right of personal privacy includes the abortion decision. And then the court continues. State criminal abortion laws that accept from criminality only a life-saving procedure on the woman's behalf without regard to the stage of her pregnancy and other interests involved violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which protects against the right to privacy, including a woman's qualified right to terminate her pregnancy. That is what is said in the decision. This so-called right to privacy was achieved in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. Yet there is no right to privacy found in the Constitution, not because the founders neglected to mention it, but because they admitted it purposefully. Note the Fourth Amendment, which says, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation. A right to privacy would afford immunity to those who committed illegitimate acts on private property. The Constitution specifically addresses the issue of privacy and denies it the stature of an absolute right. Many of the arguments offered by the pro-choice movement illustrate the weakness of its case. Let's begin with the oft-mentioned refrain that the baby is part of the mother. A woman is born with all of her organs, her heart and kidneys and so forth. However, an infant in the uterus is not one of them. Every cell that is part of the woman's body has the same DNA structure and is distinct from the DNA structure of the infant's cells. Every cell of the infant's body has a DNA structure identical to its other cells and distinct from that of the mother's. Once a woman is pregnant, the mother's blood circulates to every one of her organs. It does not circulate through the child. The excuse, the infant has its own unique genetic makeup. The baby has its own organs, brain, heart, kidneys, lungs, and nervous system. It responds independently to stimuli. The in utero infant responds independently to the mother. The excuse is offered that pregnancies that result from, this is another one, the excuse is offered that pregnancies that result from rape or incest justify abortion. Such is the depth of the pro-choice movement's perversion that while the criminal perpetrator's right to a fair trial is protected, and he is always spared criminal punishment, adherents to the pro-choice movement have no qualms in consenting to the killing of the completely innocent party, the infant. There is also the frequently offered excuse that children should not be born into an environment of poverty or where the level of care might not be the best. If being born into suboptimal living conditions is a valid rationale for abortion, then let us kill everyone who will be born into poverty. Let us kill all those who are born in the third world so that they will not suffer the privations of a third world existence. Maybe all pregnancies in the Dark Ages should have been aborted. Then where would we be today? Is everyone who is born into privilege destined to live a happy and satisfying life? Who is to say which life is worth living and which is not? Who are we to say who deserves to live and die? Ask any child born into poverty whether he or she prefers to be alive or never to have existed. The pro-choice movement promotes the concept that because the in utero infant cannot survive without the sustenance provided by the mother should have complete dominion over the fate of her infant. Yet, does not a newborn infant also require sustenance from the mother, without which the infant would perish? Are there not adults who require constant care? This does not give the caregiver the prerogative to end the life of the person under his or her care. We do not permit the killing of a newborn simply because it is dependent on its mother. The pro-choice adherents assert that an in utero infant can be killed because its incomplete development makes it less than human. Yet development and maturation continue well after birth. The fetal circulation changes radically after birth. Fetal hemoglobin is replaced by adult hemoglobin months after delivery. And the brain continues to develop morphologically for years after delivery, as do other parts of the body. Sexual maturation does not even begin until the teenage years and is not complete until the late teens. Based on such logic, a mother could kill her child legally well into the teen years. Paradoxically, laws enacted to protect sea turtles include protection of the undeveloped turtle embryo in the egg under the supposition that the turtle embryo will eventually develop into a mature sea turtle. Yet, the same rationale that is used to protect the sea turtle embryo is denied to the human embryo. All of these arguments are meaningless and, in light of present-day knowledge, patently absurd. The pro-choice lobby says the infant can be killed for the period of time where the infant cannot sense pain. Even if such a period exists, it is only temporary. There are paralyzed individuals who cannot feel pain. Does this confer a right to kill? The pro-choice lobby says that the in utero infant's brain is not capable of conscious thought and thus may be killed. Yet, this is also a temporary state. Medications can deprive any human being of conscious thought temporarily. This does not confer a right to kill the individual during this period of unconsciousness. Therefore, the conditions of the infant, which the pro-choice lobby uses as fallacious justifications for killing the infant, are but temporary and disappear if the infant is allowed to mature unimpeded. These are the tactics used by the pro-choice lobby, fabricating excuses, applying absurd logic, and denying basic science and biology. The court admitted it cannot determine when life begins. The court says we need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. When those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus, the judiciary, at this point in the development of man's knowledge, is not in a position to speculate as to the answer. That is what the court said. Yet, despite its acknowledged ignorance, the court was not deterred from deciding when life could be ended. Manufacturing distinctions by assigning to the in utero infant arbitrarily drawn degrees of value as a human being. The medical designation of trimesters was arbitrarily drawn and used inappropriately by the non-physicians who constitute the court. And we will get to what the non-physicians who constitute the court said in the Roe v. Wade decision after this short commercial break. 7 and KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the microphone, back after this short break. We're back. 7 and KRV TalkBack, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. This is from the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. With respect to the state's important and legitimate interest in the health of the mother, the compelling point in light of present medical knowledge is at approximately the end of the first trimester. This is so because of the now established medical fact that until the end of the first trimester, mortality in abortion may be less than mortality in normal childbirth. Thus, for the state prior to approximately the end of the first trimester, the abortion decision and its effectuation must be left to the medical judgment of the pregnant woman's attending physician. That is what the Supreme Court said. It strains credibility that this was the sole criterion the court used to justify unlimited abortion on demand in the first 13 weeks of gestation. This is patently nonsensical because today no such medical data exists. This criterion could logically justify the killing of any other human being because there is an infinitesimal potential risk that each human being poses to every other human being. The court must have realized that medical knowledge is continuously advancing, and as such, what is impossible today could very well be possible in the future. For the court to apply a standard based on evidence that is static is unwarranted and unconstitutional. The Fifth Amendment requires due process prior to the taking of a human life, but the court declared legal for all time the denial of due process to an infant for no other reason than that the infant is 13 weeks or fewer of gestation. The decision arbitrarily deems the life of the mother more worthy than the life of the infant without due process. In regard to sacrosanct medical judgment, history is replete with circumstances where medical judgment has bent to political will or avarice. Nazi physicians performing experimentation on unwilling human subjects and Russian physicians incarcerating dissidents in psychiatric institutions are two of the more recent examples. Numerous medical therapies, such as bloodletting, once a well-accepted medical practice, have subsequently been shown to be worthless and dangerous. Medical judgment and the judgment of a physician are not the same. The court treated the life of an in utero human infant in the first 13 weeks of gestation as irrelevant. The court continued with its pseudo-medical interpretation. The court says in its decision, for the stage subsequent to approximately the end of the first trimester, the state, in promoting its interest in the health of the mother, may, if it chooses, regulate the abortion procedure in ways that are reasonably related to maternal health. That is what the court said. The court omitted the in utero infant completely, permitting state intervention only as it pertains to the health of the mother. And then finally the court says, for the stage subsequent to viability, the state, in promoting the interest in the potentiality of human life, may, if it chooses, regulate and even proscribe abortion. That is what the court said. Only at this stage was the infant referred to and taken into consideration. Where did the state source these distinctions? Is there any doubt that pregnancy is a continuum of the same living being? To use this arbitrarily drawn designation of trimesters to determine the legal guidelines for the commission of an abortion is without merit. What is the intrinsic difference between an in utero infant of 13 weeks and one of 13 weeks and a day? Is the infant less human and less worthy of life by lacking a single day of development? Normal, viable infants are routinely delivered to full-term gestation. How is the infant a human being at delivery, but less so a single moment prior to delivery? Any mother, or for that matter, any rational human being, would never ascribe to the notion that the infant at 40 weeks is somehow different from that of 13 weeks gestation. Yet the latter infant is under varying degrees of threat of losing its life based solely on its position in the time frame of pregnancy. By pursuing the line of reasoning, the court was forced to recognize the eventual viability of an obviously human infant at some point during pregnancy and arbitrarily chose the third trimester. This is what it wrote in the decision. For the stage subsequent to viability, the state, in promoting its interest in the potentiality of human life, may, if it chooses, regulate and even proscribe abortion. The question of viability was raised, but viability was given a specific legal criterion by the court that is invalid outside the courtroom. The infant is perfectly viable in the womb and becomes non-viable through an arbitrary, unnatural act of a forced premature delivery. If the pregnancy is allowed to progress naturally, the infant will become viable in the new environment. This contrived definition of the viability of the in utero infant, legalizing the infant's killing, is as illegitimate as asserting that because a human being under medical management may temporarily not be viable without assistance, therefore during that period of time the human being may be killed. In issues of coma and brain death, the pertinent question is whether any positive change in condition will occur in the future. If the answer is in the affirmative, then time is taken to allow for the evolving improvement to occur, and killing the person is prohibited. This is denied to the in utero infant. The issue of viability takes on aspects of hitting a moving target, because the post-gestational age that confers viability outside the womb has changed drastically over the years due to advances in medical management that now permit survival at a much earlier post-gestational age. If the undelivered infant in the first 13 weeks is distinct from the infant later in gestation, then what is the infant exactly at different dates of pregnancy? The infant's definition seems to be in a continual state of flux. In the first 13 weeks, the in utero infant's life is irrelevant. In the second trimester, there is some confusion and references made to maternal health considerations. By the third trimester, the infant's viability finally comes into play, and the court has painted itself into a corner. In the first 2 trimesters, the implication is that the infant's life is less than human, and killing the infant is insulated from the law. Yet by the third trimester, viability is evident, and the infant appears distinctly human. Now taking of the infant's life could be considered homicide. Therefore, the infant might fall under protection of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. The court overcame this obstacle by employing its by now familiar routine of altering definitions to suit its desires, as it wrote of the undelivered viable infant, and this is what it says in the decision. All this together persuades us that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment, does not include the unborn. In short, the unborn have never been recognized in the law as persons in the whole sense. In times past, the process of pregnancy was shrouded in mystery. Now that science has lifted the shroud, it is inexcusable to persist in using ancient beliefs in today's society. The court used multiple precedents to deny that the in utero infant is human, but all those earlier decisions are irrelevant if what is proved true refutes all that is previously understood. So even the terminology of what born represents has been changed. It ought to be changed. What does the word born mean? The word born means at the point of creation. Historically or traditionally, the word born we use it to mean the time of delivery. But that is now no longer the case. The word born means at the point of conception. Therefore, we need to alter our terminology in order to understand the new way or advance our thinking to that of what is scientific. And that is that born ought to be at the point of conception. So the court decides to change definitions. As I've stated, in times past, the process of pregnancy has been shrouded in mystery. The court used multiple precedents to deny that the in utero infant is human, but all those earlier decisions are irrelevant if what is proved true refutes all that was previously understood. If lawyers and judges and mothers insist that the in utero infant has not been born and is not human, it is of no more validity than if they insist that the world is flat. For the court to have accepted disproved ancient precedents and scientific falsehoods as legitimate arguments demonstrates that the court was corrupt and unworthy of continued existence. Such an unethical interpretation of the Constitution is nothing new for the Supreme Court. A similar conclusion is found in another Supreme Court decision. This is what the court says. The question before us is whether the class of persons described are constituent members of this sovereignty. We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. These are the words used in the majority opinion in the Dred Scott decision of 1857 in reference to black slaves' constitutional standing. The slaves had none, according to the decision, much the same as the in utero infant now had none. The Dred Scott decision affirmed the legality of slavery, not its legitimacy. The Roe v. Wade decision affirmed the legality of abortion, not its legitimacy. The same rationale was used in the Nuremberg laws of 1935, denying German Jews the rights of citizenship in Germany. This ruling led to the Holocaust, the legalized homicide of 6 million Jews. The Roe v. Wade decision is merely a pretext that conceals the court's true intention achieving government's age-old prime motive of shifting power from the people to the government. The court sought to buttress its fallacious arguments by demonizing children and childbirth. The detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice altogether is apparent. This is a Supreme Court decision. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by child care. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child, and there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable, psychologically and otherwise, to care for it. All these are factors the woman and her responsible physician necessarily will consider in consultation. That is what the Supreme Court said. The same rationale to justify the killing of the in utero infant on the basis of convenience could be used to terminate a child's life even after delivery. It is of particular note the little importance the court granted to the life of a child relative to the far greater importance granted to a mother's convenience. The court attempted to reclassify murder as justifiable homicide. Homicide is the killing of a human being. Homicide can be justifiable and thus legal, or it can be unjustifiable and thus illegal, in which case it is referred to as murder. The act is identical. It's the law, not the act, that distinguishes between. It is the law, not the act, which distinguishes the differences between murder and homicide. And so, therefore, the court attempts to confuse the issue. The court attempts to reclassify murder as justifiable. If justification is claimed, the validity must be determined by due process. The court said that the killing of the in utero infant does not necessitate the requirement of due process as demanded by the Fifth Amendment by asserting that the in utero infant was not human. If it is not human, then what is it? What actually is the difference between an in utero infant and a post-delivery infant? Ultimately, the court was oblivious to all such consideration, remaining undeterred in its pursuit of an agenda permitting the killing of the infant at any stage of pregnancy, by then tossing the proverbial kitchen sink into its decision. The court shifted the balance between the conflicting desires of the mother and the baby completely to the mother's side by adding this phrase in reference to the state's potential to intervene in preventing the abortion of the in utero infant's life. The court said, except where necessary and appropriate medical judgment for the preservation of the life or health of the mother. This is by far the most frequently, that was what the court said. This is by far the most frequently offered excuse to justify abortion on demand, but it is simultaneously the most fallacious and insidious. On this rationale, every attempt to limit abortion on demand is struck down by the courts. Consider this fact. There are no illnesses in the pregnant woman that require the intentional killing of the in utero infant. There are conditions occurring during pregnancy that may require an earlier than term delivery, but the intentional killing of the in utero infant is never ever required to preserve the health of the mother. In fact, the most commonly diagnosed illness in the mother to validate abortion is not a physical one, but a diagnosis of psychological distress. There are no objective tests that can certify psychological illness. Thus, the subjective symptoms are easy to fake on the part of the patient, and the diagnosis is easy to falsify by the physician abortionist. Does abortion require the death of the infant? The court is relegated once again to the perversion of language. Abortion is the termination of any process prior to completion. The abortion of pregnancy is not the same as the abortion of life. The abortion of life is the premature termination of life. The abortion of pregnancy is the premature termination of pregnancy, which can be accomplished with the delivery of a viable infant. Achieving the abortion of pregnancy without the necessity of killing the in utero infant threatened the very linchpin of the Roe v. Wade decision. Because pregnancy could be successfully aborted, but the infant's life still preserved, the court required yet a perversion of language to achieve its true motive of the intentional killing of the undelivered infant. The court overcame this obstacle through an altered definition of abortion. The court's contrived new definition of abortion was the termination of human pregnancy with an intention other than to produce a live birth. Thus, the true purpose of abortion was revealed. It is not the premature termination of pregnancy for reasons of mother's health, but the killing of the infant. The distinction lies in the intent. The abortion of a pregnancy for reasons of a mother's health may lead to the death of the infant as a consequence of extreme prematurity, which is distinct from those abortions of pregnancy whose intent is the abortion of the infant's life. The sinister purpose of legalizing the abortion of pregnancy as granted in the Roe v. Wade decision was the intentional abortion of an infant's life for the convenience of the mother or her partner. The court created non-existent rights while simultaneously denying existing rights, extrapolated conclusions based on false premises, admitted as evidence mysticisms, myths, superstitions, notions, and beliefs long discarded, and applied faulty logic to draw erroneous conclusions. There is not a single valid point justifying its position. Under such tortured reasoning was abortion on demand ratified. Unfortunately, legal decisions such as Roe v. Wade that result in the killing of innocents are not unique in the history of the world. The slaughter occasioned by the Nazis, the communists, the Turks, and the Hutus were legally sanctioned by their courts, defended by the useful dupes and collaborators in the government, the media, and system of education, and lauded and applauded by much of their country's own populations, empowering the likes of Hitler of Germany, Stalin of the Soviet Union, Mao of Red China, Talat of Turkey, Kambanda of Rwanda, and now Barack Obama of the United States, and all of those who seek to deny rights, enslave, oppress, and even commit genocide. We've witnessed it before. We are witnessing it today. Such ignorance is to be condemned. It's not a battle between the religious and the secular, but a battle between truth and falsehood, right and wrong, good and evil. The pro-choice movement is based on lies, not in part, but in its entirety. Lies promulgated by liars, frauds, and dupes. It is based on junk science and junk law. It is a movement that promotes big government over the rights of the individual. It's a war which most citizens are unaware is even being fought. Future generations will look upon us in the same manner that we look upon those who stood idly by while the mass killing of innocent human beings proceeded unabated, much to humanity's everlasting shame. Since the passage of the Roe v. Wade decision in 1972, there have been at least 50 million documented murdering of innocent children in this country, promoted by a significant proportion of the population. No different than the populations of Nazi Germany or other nations that considered a homicide of the innocent legal. The pro-choice proponents in this country are no different than the Nazi population in Germany between 1928 and 1945. Their psychology is identical. They both believe in the superiority of one group over another. In Nazi Germany, they believed in the group of Aryans over other races. In the United States and other countries, we believe in there's a superiority of one human being over another human being simply because the other human being happens to be in utero for a period of time. This is completely unjustifiable. And it is amazing to me how this nation considers the slaughter of the innocent human being perfectly acceptable. But what is the surprise? Those in Germany at the time of the Holocaust considered the elimination of the Jewish population perfectly legitimate at the time. Those people were psychologically the same as the pro-choice movement is today. Those are the very same people that we considered our allies in 1946. So we should not be surprised. We should not be surprised that the media, the political class, and the system of public education promotes the killing of the in utero infant, which is exactly the same as it occurred in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It is up to the rest of us who are thinking and rational human beings who believe in the sanctity of life, who understand that without the right to life, that no other right has any significance. That the flow of rights emanates from the right to life, and that without the right to life, no other right means anything. The removal of the right to life is what government wants. Because if government can eliminate the right to life, then it can eliminate any right. And that's what government wants to do. The government wants to be in charge of your life. It wants to make your life meaningless, except as how it relates to government. Government is the entity that wants to be preserved. Government wants you, all of us, to be serfs and slaves of the government. That is why they exist. That is what their purpose is. It doesn't matter what the government says it represents. Governments only represent itself. Government has no feeling for the people, has no feeling for human rights, has no feeling for the sanctity of life. That is why it is written in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is why in the Constitution, that the taking of life requires due process. If this were natural to government, these ideologies, these beliefs would not have to have been written. If men were angels, no constitution would be necessary. But man is not angelic, and therefore the Constitution was meant to protect us. That is why the government has undermined, subverted, and corrupted the Constitution. 7th and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. 7th and KURV.